Okay, I think we'll get started. It's 5 past the hour. Welcome to the first Fairbanks Center Modern China lecture of the academic year. And it's really wonderful to see so many people here. We're starting the year off with a real bang. So thank you, Rebecca, for making that happen. My name is Arunabh Ghosh. I teach modern Chinese history in the history department here. I'm also the convener of this lecture series. Before I introduce Rebecca, I want to quickly announce some of our upcoming talks so you can mark your calendars. Monday, October 21st, will be our next Modern China lecture, and the speaker will be Janet Chen from Princeton University. And then on November 5th, which is a Tuesday, we will have Selda Altan from Randolph College. Janet we haven't heard what the topic exactly will be, but Selda's will be actually on her just published book, which is on the Vietnam Yunnan Railway and sort of a labor history of the railway. So she'll be talking about aspects of that. So Monday, October 21st and Tuesday, November 5th, both talks at 4 p.m. So please join us if you can then. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back to Harvard and back to the Fairbanks Center, Professor Rebecca Nedostup, who is Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Brown University. I say welcome back because Professor Nedostup is actually a graduate of the college, and is also a non-resident associate of the Fairbanks Center, so multiple affiliations that we enjoy. She is a historian of modern China with interests that include displacement and emplacement and the social and political roles of the living and the dead amid mass violence. She's the author of Superstitious Regimes, Religion and the Politics of Chinese Modernity, a terrific monograph that explores how the nationalist state under Chiang Kai-shek sought to categorize popular religious practices in pursuit of a sort of modern secular vision. She's now working on a new book titled Living and Dying in the Long War, on the making and unmaking of community among people displaced by conflict across China and Taiwan from the 1930s to the 1950s, and I presume we'll be hearing more about that project shortly. She also has other future projects on the anvil, one of them on property relations, spatial memory, and transitional justice in Taiwan. And she has also been involved in shaping curricula for secondary education. Since 2021, she has been the faculty director for the Choices program, which produces innovative curriculum and videos for secondary history and current issues education. So the talk today is titled War Being in Mid-20th Century China and Taiwan. Before I hand things over, just a quick word about format. Rebecca will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have an open Q&A for about half an hour, going on till 5:15, but we have time till 5:30, so we can really stretch it. We have a terrific audience, so we probably will stretch it to 5:30 today. Look forward to that too. Okay, so Rebecca, a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arunabh, for the invitation to be here. And it is really nice to return after the fog of COVID, which seems to have separated. I live in Providence, not very far away, but it seems so quite distant in the past several years. So it is wonderful to be back here. And I want to also thank Mark and Sam for their help in the arrangements, and also grad students Will Sack and Xiaorui Zhou for their help as well in arranging things to meet with students. So indeed, what I want to present today is some central concepts in my forthcoming monograph, and maybe test out a better title. We'll see. I'm thinking about war being as a concept as well as a title. So I appreciate your input. And what do I mean by war being? So we now have a wonderful body of research on, particularly on the Second Sino-Japanese War, but increasingly on the Chinese Civil War and the Cold War as well. And actually a number of people in this room have contributed to that, building up that field. And what we have sense from that, or know from that now, is the importance of war in shaping transitions in a number of different ways in China. Shaping a transition in how people understand and disseminate and gather information about territory, how states but also other actors think about the control and use of territory. And also there's some very interesting arguments about the rise of establishment and rise of national consciousness during this period. We've also know a lot more now about the transformation of economic and growth of economic and political institutions on both a national scale and a transnational scale. And transnationally, I'm thinking not just of corporate economies, but also economies of humanitarianism and China's participation in international bodies. And then also we have a growing body of work on population movement, forced migration, and a lot of it focuses on the idea of exile especially. And I think that's somewhat shaped by the kinds of sources that people have used. And I'll talk more about that in a second. What I've been doing in this book that I've been writing for far too long is using a framework of displacement to look at population movement and both local and familial territorial consciousness. What I found is helpful for me using the framework of displacement is it is a more capacious category for understanding all the different emic and etic namings of people on the move during this period, so coming from within those communities and from outside those communities. One of which is the term refugee, and as many of you no doubt know, there's a kind of tension between a capacious use of the term nanmin in Chinese documents from this time period, and then the increasing constriction of the political category of refugee internationally, which often is dependent on crossing international borders. But that in the Chinese documents, you have both cases, both what we would call internally displaced peoples and people crossing borders. But then also there's a set of historical actors who distinguish themselves from refugees on the basis of class, on the basis of a level of education, on the basis of political belonging. And so the most obvious example of that is the Chiang Kai-shek regime in Taiwan, who don't consider themselves refugees, but are part of this general process of displacement, I would say. So they may think of themselves as exiles or temporarily embarrassed people in government, but this give and take between those two categories is really interesting. We also see the rise of other kinds of nomenclature, thinking of people as comrades, either like sort of physically belonging in the nation and sometimes lost, so like Tongbao or Nanbao during this time. And then in a lot of other kinds of documents, including genealogies or diaries, more sort of reflecting communities of locality or family, we see terms like drifting, wandering, and the wandering living as well as the wandering dead. So these are the kinds of things that I've been interested in this book. And in today, I'm going to focus in particular on a couple of implications of displacement. One is that displacement is taking place in time as well as space. So there's a lot of planning, of longing, of separation that people are conceiving of in longer term frameworks than mere survival or mere victory. There's also shorter term relationships, what we can think of maybe as kinship of the road, people who are who become refugees or displaced and relying on a very extensive network of social relations to get them through that experience. And sometimes that's social relations they already had established with family, but a lot of times it's with coworkers or people that they're thrown together with on the road or in refugee shelters. And those relationships prove to be there's sometimes relationships of the moment, but they're extremely significant for people. Displacement can also happen in place. So I'm very interested in thinking about what happens to people who don't leave. How do you choose to leave? And also, when people do leave and arrive in a new place, you have a third kind of displacement of the receiving population having to adjust to new arrivals. And so I'm very interested in this as a common experience of wartime in the mid-20th century, and a continual one, meaning that there are people who experience displacement due to the Second Sino-Japanese War, then due to the Civil War, then due to the hot Cold War as it's experienced in East Asia. So I'm very interested in kind of respecting this kind of ubiquity of experience for people living through this generation from the 1930s through the 1950s, and as a way of doing a cross-strait history. So to think about how experiences of displacement are shared and then sometimes distinctive in China and Taiwan. So one way we can think of, so today I'm really looking at the social experience of displacement and the political framework, but also displacement as an information system. Going back to this question of how do people know when to leave, where to go, when to come back, et cetera. And I'm very interested in how this shapes people's consciousness and the consciousness of space and time, but also social relations. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this concept of war being. So if we think of flight as kind of information systems, enabled by information systems, but sometimes they're better, sometimes they're very weak, and social ties also weak and strong. We can see a few different kinds. One is the information system of nationalism. And by thinking of kind of the national political discourse as an information system, I'm thinking of it as a series of social and political cues. And it's particularly obvious in the first half of the first half year of the war, the second half of 1937, when you had, and my local history material comes from Jiangsu, it comes from Sichuan, and it comes from Taiwan. And so looking at Jiangsu, especially southern Jiangsu, the corridor between Nanjing and Shanghai, after the beginning of the Battle of Shanghai, there's a tremendous movement of populations back and forth across the lower Yangtze River Valley. And part of the political imperative is not just to control those crowds, but to send people back home. And this is actually, it becomes this changes dramatically during the course of the war, that imperative. But at this moment, a lot of people are being sent back and forth from Shanghai to Wuxi to Zhenjiang to Nanjing and then back again. At the same time, there's a political discourse, particularly strong in Nanjing, Nanjing newspapers especially, that urges people patriotically not to flee. And even if you look at the shaping of the category of collaborator or traitor, hanjian, during these few months, a lot of who is being defined as a hanjian are people who are abandoning their homes. So it's not even necessarily collaboration at this point as a crime. It's abandoning one's military post, but also one's business. So we see a number of really interesting articles in the newspaper, including this one, which when I read it, I kind of sat dumbstruck for a while with historical hindsight, but then I realized it's very much of its fitting in of its time too. So a kind of prose poem that was published in the Nanjing Evening News written by one of their editors, Hu Danliu, called "Nanjing is My Grave." So, yeah, you can see it here, and it's drawing on a phrase that is circulating in military circles at this time, originating partly from the General Li Hanhun, who talked about defending the southeast coast of China and making that area his grave. But this is applying not to military combatants, but to non-combatants, to civilians. This message is going out. And so on the one hand, some people are going to actually engage in combat, but others are supposed to stay and defend the capital. And this is sort of coming out of already a decade of political framing of the capital and Sun Yat-sen's tomb as being places to defend as the heart of the nation. But some of these lines I find really striking. This, we must protect the tomb that our ancestors passed down to us. So this is not just Sun Yat-sen's tomb, and also the city, and maybe the Ming Emperor's tomb and other sacred sites of Nanjing. Our bodies must die within Nanjing's walls. Our corpses must be buried around the tomb. And then combined with that, this idea of if you run, where are you going to go? If this is your home, you must stay. So of course, this was in August with historical retrospection. We know what happens in December, and this becomes kind of shocking in that light. But it is part of a larger overall program to get people to stay. Some of this was directly class-based, based at the commercial class. Some sources claim that some 60% of the commercial class of Nanjing fled in the fall and winter, fall of 1937, early winter of 1938. And there's, within the political discourse, there is a lot of discussion of this, and also things like editorials that sort of ventriloquize a patriotic business person. So in this case, this essay, I'm Not Running, written in the name of so-called like a businesswoman, a commercial woman, outlining her case for not leaving. And so this in itself, I think, constitutes part of an information system. You can see, on the one hand, that people are sharing information about when it might be a good time to flee, how they might transfer their assets, take their families, move elsewhere, is kind of in the background of these kind of articles. Because if we read the counterclaim, this is a counterclaim to something that's actually happening. That's one system of information. The other system of information, of course, is trying to discourage people from leaving. And then we know, as we get into November and December of 1937, of course, not only are business people leaving, institutions are moving, the nationalist government itself is making preparations to move. So this is one level of like the circulation of information, and I think one of the things that it raises too is how close do you have to be to schools, to political institutions, to government institutions, or to large commercial networks to know what is going on? Because at the same time there's reporting on attacks and troop movements. People have their own eyes, or their bodies experience bombing, and there's several dozen bombing raids on Nanjing during this time. But I think people who are much more embedded in these political and social institutions tend to get better information and more timely information about where to go, and also are able to move with their work unit or move with their within their commercial network. So what happens to people who don't have that advantage? I'll give you a couple of examples. It's kind of interesting to see. So one is taken from a diary of Sun Jingyun, who was a high school teacher in a fairly small town in Jiangning province, so very near to Nanjing. So on one hand, we would think high school teachers are pretty well connected, but her diary kind of shows some other indications. So she flees the town where they're living with her husband and small child. So that's, first of all, that's a consideration there, is like, how are you traveling with how many people, and who among those people are particularly vulnerable? And So we know from her diary that she, so this is Hongshijun, and I apologize for the Google Maps. I feel very shamed coming to Harvard, home of historical Chinese GIS, and showing you Google Maps. But this is the first stage of map production in my research. But I wanted to kind of show you what the route of their travel. So by the time of the book, we'll have better maps. But they're going from Hengqi, and the way they figured to leave is the principal of the school has been out, like in outside or Waimian, and he comes back and he says on December 5th, right? So this is a little more than a week before the Japanese take control of Nanjing. He says things are looking bad, and Nanjing is particularly bad, so we need to leave. Then we see a number of interesting choices. So he is from Tianjin, and her family is from Yancheng in northeastern Jiangsu. So he realizes Tianjin, there's no way to kind of go on travel on commercial transportation routes at this point because of the fighting between the Tianjin and Nanjing corridor. So Sun invites him, the principal, to come along with them and go to Yancheng. And one thing to think of is, so this is as indicated by Google Maps. So this is based on the existence of modern highways. We're talking about a distance of 168 miles. Looking at this super helpful website, which I owe Richard Shi knowledge of, Pastway, which calculates travel time on different vehicles at around the time of the year 1950, right? So we have to think this is already a little bit ahead of time for us in terms of what is available. But choosing on this tool, the vehicle, the ways that I know that this group traveled. So on foot, on kind of commercial ship, basically what they just called a steamship, but I think we're thinking very, very small flywheel ships, and then very small fishing boats, hand-paddled fishing boats. It should have taken about 4 days. The trip actually took 12 days, so nearly 2 weeks. So why does it take 12 days? What happens in between? One is that they're forced to stay in people's houses, by and large, because in every large town that they go to, things are already shut down. And so that's a sign of commercial flight, and then also protection. No stores, no restaurants, very few hotels. So for shelter and food, they're forced to rely on local people, and then convincing local people to let them in also becomes a very big issue. At every stage of this trip, there is also, just to go back, they encounter people who are panicking, who want to leave, are unsure of where to leave, are unsure of where to go. So the other, I think, characteristic is that there's an effort to find others to travel with all the time. So sometimes, someone will go out, half the party will rest, some other people will go out on the street and they'll come back and say, hey, we've met these guys from Yancheng too. We can travel together. Why is it so important to travel together? I think it's not just the insecurity of war, but some really specific things. Men of adult age who are say between teens and 30s are extremely worried about conscription or being seized by one side or the other, by the Japanese, being seized by the Nationalist Army, being seized by militias or what people refer to as bandit groups. So there's a vulnerability of men, adult men. There's also, and we'll see this even more in a subsequent example, the vulnerability of women, particularly women from their teens, also through their 30s, 40s, 50s, and sexual violence. So what we see in this diary is a lot of times where these potential fellow travelers, in the broadest sense, fellow travelers might emerge, and then they just disappear. The next day comes, they don't show up. And the decision comes, and these are all like very mundane decisions, but in the moment, they're kind of like life and death. Do we wait for these people to show up, or do we try to find another way to leave? And you get a sense reading the diary with each ticking minute, people feel more and more vulnerable to either to a bombing raid or to the arrival of Japanese troops. Officers sometimes appear, army officers, which can be helpful. Eventually, the Tianjin colleague gets a ride on an army truck to Tianjin, but they also raise the potential of they might take you to the front as well. So what happens here is, they know to deliberately avoid Nanjing because of the advance on the city. So they have to they try to go to the riverside in Jiangning to get a boat. And just to show you, maybe here, okay. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead a sec to show you some boats. Oh yeah, here. So what are the kind of boats that people are looking for, thinking, so everyone, the first thing they have in their mind are these like large commercial boats that would go along the Yangtze or go across Lake Tai or go north along the old canal routes and interior routes to northern Jiangsu. But what they find quickly is there are no more of these kind of this boat travel, because boats of substantial size and in good shape are being confiscated, requisitioned by the armed forces. So when they get to Jiangning, there's a whole scene of like crowds and crowds of people at the side of at the riverbank, trying to figure out how to get across the Yangtze River. And even at this point, these smaller boats, like boats smaller boats with sails, or like the hand-paddled boats, are kind of in hiding at this point, because even if they haven't been confiscated, but they don't want to be confiscated or requisitioned. So the process of trying to actually find a boat, find a willing boat person to take you, and then to give them kind of the courage to go, comes up a lot in this diary. There are several times when this party gets on a boat and it doesn't leave because the proprietor, the boat's person, is too panicked panicked really into paralysis. They don't want to leave, but they know that if they stay there, it's also a problem. So this sense of how you actually come to the decision to go or not and where to go is extremely complex and very fraught at this time. So when they finally do manage to get on a fairly lengthy boat trip, this is taking them from, they go through Pukou on the other side of the Yangtze River, and then up into Yangzhou, because someone at this point has told them, well, there's no boats all the way to Yancheng, so you have to go to Yangzhou and then get another boat north. They are lucky to encounter a boatsman who is, he trades in wood fuel. He has a sister who is from Yangzhou, and she needs to be brought home. Because she's, I think she's pregnant actually, so she needs to be brought home. So they managed to take a boat all the way and then to near Yangzhou and end up here in her family's home, the sister's family's home, where they are welcomed into this feast of return for the sister. They become kind of part of the household at that moment. at that point, they become very dependent on that particular sister because she and her father go out like hour after hour, over the course of a few days, trying to find someone who will take money to go. At this point, like money is not even the object. They have money. They're willing to part with it. But finding someone to take them. And so in the end, the sister says, I don't care, don't pay me, I don't want money, I'll carry your stuff to Xiaobozhen, and we'll find a boat there. So these kind of like kinships of the moment or alliances of the moment become extremely critical to people's survival. And that is, the diary is full of gratitude for this woman in particular. Throughout this trip, there is also deep anxiety and fear. And it's partly because they've come through, I don't actually have pictures of Pukou, that part of Greater Nanjing, and its bombing. But this is a picture of Nanjing City itself, just to give you a sense of some of the destruction that was carried out by Japanese bombers during that time. And the diary talks about just like walking amidst these piles of rubble, piles of bricks, and then interspersed with piles of bodies in Pukou, when they actually are able to see from a distance Japanese fighters arrive and drop bombs. And the kind of panic it instills is, and fear is, I think, thoroughgoing. Sun talks about seeing the fighters from a great distance, and then everyone a group of people who are on the road with her run into a field and kind of like hide under a tree and hide in some like farming equipment. And then finally one of their group stands up and he says like, they're not going to come here and drop a bomb on us. That would be wasting a bomb. So he stands up and gets everyone moving again. But that impulse to like you see or hear a plane and to drop and hide is very, very strong during this time, even if it's not close to you. So you see even this early period, this kind of traumatization that happens in the moment. So they finally do make it to Yancheng, and in a way, the quickest route is when they finally do get a kind of larger commercial boat from Xiaobo to Yancheng. One other experiential thing in the diary that I'll mention is that Sun talks about the peace and quiet of being on the water, partly because all the other boats are gone. Sometimes they're the only boat on the water. But seeing the water and the moonlight, and contrast that with like what it is to move by land during the daytime, which is this kind of panic-stricken, fearful moment. To contrast with that, I've been looking at some of the Nanjing Massacre oral history testimonies and looking at them from the point of view of what they can actually tell us about flight and social relations during that time. So I'll just give you one example, which is the testimony given by Chen Guixiang, who just passed away last year. And so she was 14 in Chinese age reckoning in 1937. And she was already in straitened circumstances because she was her parents had died, and so she was living with her maternal grandmother in a small town, what is then a small town, Toguansun, in the southern part of Nanjing. And you can kind of get a sense here from the Google map still of what, even today, what with enormous urbanization, and this area is very built up now, what this area is like in environmental terms, that they still actually have like a wetland park there. So the sense you get from her story, her recounting her memories, is very much dependent on that kind of environment and the wetlands. They don't realize in the inquiry, the interviewer asked, like, when were you aware that the Japanese were coming? And this is a case where she says, we didn't know until we saw the bombs drop, like in this area, this southern part of Jiangxingzhou, where there were nationalist factories, like munitions factories, that were bombed. And in her telling, they missed the factory, but they got us. They got their little village, and a lot of the houses were destroyed, and hers was not completely destroyed, but ruined. So as a result, then she goes to here. So this is quite distant for, especially we're assuming they're traveling on foot with her grandmother to Miaoqian, which is where so they rely on familial relations at that point. There's an uncle there. So we're going to go to the south, and a lot, in her telling, a lot of people are fleeing this short distance. They're going to like Guli and other very close nearby areas, because that's the pattern that most people have used previously in Chinese history or society, is you flee enough to get away from the immediate danger. You don't go with the thinking that you're going to be moving, thousands of miles across the country or across the oceans and so on. So this is how they're operating at this time. They're in Miaoqian for maybe a couple of weeks or a month or so, but then Japanese soldiers start to appear around Miaoqian. And this is when the vulnerability of young women comes to the fore. Not only the possibility, and she did face this at a couple times, of being menaced by Japanese soldiers, but the fear, the social fear that creates. Because the uncle says, I'm leaving, we're not safe anymore, I'm leaving, I'm going to another place, and basically you can't come with me, to her and to her grandmother. Because of the fear, and she uses this phrase a lot, that you will bring disaster upon me, or you will bring calamity. And I think within that we can interpret it to mean that a young woman seen as vulnerable would attract the attention of Japanese soldiers, and anybody trying to protect that woman or girl would be themselves vulnerable. And so this happens in her story a couple of times. So she and her grandmother go back all the way to Toguan, and there they do encounter Japanese soldiers repeatedly, twice in fact. The first time that she and another classmate of hers are singled out by Japanese soldiers, her grandmother kneels down in front of the Japanese soldier, and then together they beg to spare her. And this sounds on the surface maybe a little fantastical, but that kind of action actually appears in other kinds of diaries as well. If you look at some of the diaries of the Nanjing refugee zone, there are in Jinling College, there are stories of, particularly Chen Chuifang's diary. She talks about numerous times in which young women were grabbed by Japanese soldiers, ready to be taken away, and the older women in that refugee camp came out and begged for them, and saying that they were their grandmothers. Oftentimes they weren't. And she says, oh, there's this one woman who went out like 2 or 3 times in a day, claiming that various young women were her granddaughters. And they actually managed to keep some of them behind that way. Chen's classmate did not have any family members near her, and so she was taken and sexually assaulted. The second time, though, she had been instructed, Chen had been instructed by a person whose house they were living in, because their house was destroyed or not in good condition, to hide in an upper level, I think maybe like a loft kind of area, with another young woman. And then it so happened that they were discovered by a Japanese soldier. This time her grandmother tried to do the same thing, but this time was beaten with the butt of a rifle and died from her injuries. Chen manages to escape from the soldier, and that's when another interesting set of relationships emerges. So at this point, she's fairly near the riverside. She runs to the riverside. She describes like jumping in the mud and being covered in the mud. And there's a boatsperson there, like what she says, like a 50 to 60-year-old Hunanese boatsperson that covers her up with reeds and grasses and helps her hide. And she says she remained there for quite some time, and eventually some of the local residents came around and were like wondering. They thought, oh, the grandmother died, probably the granddaughter died as well. And he said, no, I've been like helping to keep her safe. So she comes into the community. Some people in the community help her go door to door collecting money for coffin boards to bury her grandmother. So that's like the first thing they do, is to bury the grandmother. The second thing is that she's sort of taken under the wing of an older man, a man named Wei, who also eventually, after a couple months, says, you have to leave my house. You will bring disaster upon my house. So repeatedly, we see older men extending protection and then feeling themselves vulnerable, sending her back out. So in the end, she is given to another family, I think probably sold to another family as a tongyangchi, as a child bride. And that becomes her husband's family. And she spends time there in a neighboring village here in Shodai. So this is an even smaller scale in terms of geography than the first case, and a smaller scale than people who eventually move all the way to Hunan, Sichuan, and so on. But it's just illustrative of the importance of these kinds of social ties and the conditions under which people become greatly endangered or not. One thing that Chen says is that, and this kind of fits in with other materials, is that after March or so, 1938, conditions settle down because the Japanese authorities start to issue certificates, sort of refugee certificates. But she sees those as a double-edged sword, that what she says, they're meant to certify whether you're considered a liangmin or not, like I'm a good citizen. And she is too frightened of even engaging in that process and so she remains in that area. She says that she knows that, in Jinling that there's a refugee settlement, but she can't go there. She won't go there because in between is Shuiximen or Sanshanmen, the city gate that has to be crossed. And there you have to have ID or certification. That kind of technology of certifying and giving IDs to refugees is shared widely across regimes. This is not just a Japanese thing, the nationalists do it too, and we see it in other areas as well. It's important for issuing aid, but it's also important for other kinds of plans like resettlement. And so just to briefly talk about that a little bit, there is in the background of this a political discourse and political planning about how to resettle refugees, where to resettle them, and how to, as some people put it, make use of them, make them productive or liyong. So it's not just about aid. It's not just about like finding medicine and food and so on. It's about thinking of refugees as a resource. And as we see now, that's like globally an idea that emerges, particularly in the mid-20th century, maybe even a little bit earlier. Laura Robson's written a book about this and applying to other parts of the world. I won't go into this in great detail, but I will just say that this idea of sending refugees to farm and to claim so-called like fallow land, this Nanming Kanzhi idea, has becomes widespread during the war. It pre-exists, of course, during the war. We see it in Pierre Fuller has written about how this is used in the Northeast in the 1920s to deal with natural disaster there. And we see a lot of different actors engaging in this. So there are private charities who try to carry this out. There are urban intellectuals who have ideas that maybe the war with Japan will allow us to reshape society, and we can like shed some of our lack of capability as urban intellectuals and be together with workers and farmers. So there are some like utopian versions of this, but there are also a number of government versions of this too. Through government plans, through plans carried out by the National Resource Commission, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and so on. And some of this is actually created through like bond issues and public loans as well. One of the interesting parts of this is, as I said, I mentioned before, the idea of returning refugees back home. But as we get further into the war, that idea shifts, and people start to actually talk about how do we keep people from going back home, especially crossing the front line and going into Japanese occupied areas. So there's this political will to keep people as kind of like mobile representatives of the nation and the borders of the nation by preventing them from going back to their homes and living under the enemy. Farmers were considered to be a particular problem in this regard. There's always this idea that they're always going to want to go home. And so in some of these plans, and including in this one, you could see that it is not just, it becomes this political program, but also a program of social reshaping, social education, building on the kind of pathologization of the refugees as poor, which builds on the pathologization of the urban poor that we've seen in previous decades and that Jenna Chen, among other people, have written about. So this idea of making them into productive persons, as if refugees were never productive persons in their previous economic lives. So they need to be productive for the purposes of growing food, for instance, for the supply of the military, or weaving cloth for uniforms, or other things that will underpin national economic growth. So just to give you a sense of how some of this worked in terms of land usage and conception of borders, some of the ones I look at are all sort of in this area of Sichuan. So part of the schema was to send people, take refugees, urban refugees who are congregating in urban places like Chongqing, and send them to farm in the countryside. And particularly send them to, I forgot I had the farm in places in southern Sichuan and western Sichuan that were ethnically very diverse. So these are places that have high degrees, percentage of Yi or Miao or sometimes Tibetan populations. So part of this is about sort of border extension and security as well as economic productivity. I mention this too because there's Jinfo Shan is a famous one that was more closely tied to the production of medical herbs. But I mention this because this actually becomes this kind of thinking of not just rendering aid in place to refugees or sending them back home, but strategically resettling them becomes a very prominent idea through the Civil War and the Cold War as well. So we see it in Sichuan. Michael Muscolino has talked about similar kinds of resettlement in North China around natural disaster and war. We see it in Northwest China as well, and in places like Gansu or Xinjiang, where Chiang Kai-shek had ideas about resettling veterans or soldier farmers. But I also see it in Jiangsu during the Civil War period, where you have, on the one hand, this sort of influx of returnees from the interior of China. you have demobilized soldiers, and then you have new refugees created by the fighting between the nationalists and the communists, especially coming from northern Jiangsu. And so there are efforts to resettle a number of these kinds of returnees on these tidal flats in places like Zhenjiang. One of the reasons why Zhenjiang was targeted, and Wuxi to some extent as well, is because of an effort to get such people out of the capital. So you don't want to have them in Nanjing, but you can move them nearby and resettle them. But then there ended up being also battles about land usage that resulted because there were often seasonal migrants from northern Jiangsu who came to these areas during part of the year to farm or fish or carry out other economic activity. So it wasn't like fallow land. But we see the prioritization of people who had military service or were sometimes connected civil service in these resettlement schemes. It also appears during the Cold War. And so the most famous example in the case of Taiwan is the resettlement of people from the Dachan Island group and Nanji, some nearby island, to Taiwan during the first cross-strait crisis, the first strait crisis in 1955. So building on a few years in which these offshore islands still held by the nationalists had been heavily militarized. People had been given ID cards. People had been told, actually, you're part of the Republic of China, which they may have not really perceived greatly before. And Zhang Jingguo especially was involved in part of that militarization. But then after the Battle of Yijiangshan, control of this area was lost. There was a wholesale evacuation of 17,000, 18,000 people to Taiwan. And we see here the use of this kind of resettlement strategy that is built on nationalist government experience, but now also part of the global Cold War framework. So Dachan refugees, or Dachan loyal comrades as they're called, Ibao, are resettled around the island of Taiwan in these purpose-built communities, many of them funded partly by the US State Department. And so this is also kind of shaped by international and American thinking about agricultural development, about village development, and so on. Some of the designs of the buildings actually come from the Committee to Protect Chinese Intellectuals, some of their plans too about resettling people in Taiwan. So these areas, I think, the Dachan example, I think, gives me a good point to conclude with, because what we see here are these kind of like overlapping scales of national, international, local, and even more local, like hyper-local, as well as overlapping ideas of time and loss in the Dachan case. So there's a global, this is part of a global anti-communist Cold War discourse too, which I won't go into here, but is heavily, the evacuation is heavily covered by press in Taiwan, but also the US 7th Fleet, which had basically just wrapped up fighting in Korea, was used as transport. But in terms of the resettlement, one of the cases I looked at is in the northeastern part of Pingdong County, and that is a particularly interesting case because, again, this is an ethnically diverse area where there has a very strong Hakka community, but also within that, Pingdong has a very considerable Paiwan and Wukai community as well. So there's a kind of longer history of indigenous displacement that this is layering over. And in this case, we see in the archival documents some of the Hakka landowners lodging suit, either administrative suit or civil suit, to try to reclaim some of the land on which the Dachon people are resettled. And I think this is also a fairly common pattern, maybe not a legal process, but this process of friction or conflict when people are resettled does happen throughout these cases. But one thing that's important about the evacuation from Dachon is that people knew that it was happening ahead of time because of the heavy role of the nationalist military and the state and international assistance. It was an emergency situation, but it was planned, unlike the kind of cases of individual flight that I recounted in the earlier part of this talk. And a key thing that this allowed was actually the packing up of deities from Dachon and bringing them to Taiwan. And this ends up helping to kind of establish an important other kinds of presence in these communities in Pingdong. So you can kind of see these communities are mostly abandoned now, or the original houses are abandoned. One story is sort of the history that local Dachon and Nanjing people tell is that when they arrived, they were pushed out by local people, and the only materials that they could get to build their houses were river stones. You hear that story, though, in a number of other parts of Taiwan. Some Drensun communities in the north also have that. And so on the one hand, that speaks to this kind of multiple displacement and dislocation. But on the other hand, they were actually able to build a temple, and this is not the only case of Dachon people establishing a temple with the deities that they had brought. So this is the village in question, and this is where the temple is. And you can see here, so this is from, Google Maps on the left, my own visit in 2016 on the right. And so for subsequent generations, or half generations, especially after the 1980s, people who left the community and became much wealthier were able to support a reconstruction of the temple, and it becomes like a much grander scale. But at the same time, actually, you can see it here in the back. There's this side hall. And so the side hall is populated by spirit tablets for so-called masterless, the masterless dead, or people who have no descendants to care for them in the afterlife. And this, this becomes a common feature of like wartime thinking and post-war reconstruction in the 1940s. We see a lot of these charities setting up similar kinds of altars in Shanghai, for example. In this case, it's not a charity, and it's not necessarily for the broader public good, but it is for the good of people from Dachon and thinking about their relatives who are now divided by the border between China and Taiwan. So that either they didn't know their fate, or they weren't able to bring them with them and rebury, or they can't go back to their gravesite and make offerings. And when I visited, I was told that, so there's a big festival every year between the village and the temple during so-called Ghost Month. There's a big Pudu festival. But also that there were still some very aged people in the community that would come every day to make offerings, which I think is actually quite extraordinary if they come every day, and says something about the particular kind of levels of displacement and emplacement of this group. So that gives me like the thing, sort of suggests to me the lingering effects of war being here. So just to conclude then, I think I'm very interested in, of course, the growth of the so-called international refugee regime, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, the way that refugees are envisioned and aided in the post-war period. But I'm also interested in kinds of displacement that go beyond that. And I've learned a lot from the field that has become critical refugee studies in the past several years. That comes particularly out of Southeast Asian American studies, but now has spread to other fields as well. Long ago, 10 years ago, in body counts on the war in Vietnam, Jan Espiritu said that refugees can constitute a solution as well as a problem for nation states. So it's in this ties in very well this idea of utilizing refugees. But further writing on the field of critical refugee studies, especially the co-edited book Departures, says that we also have to return ourselves to the refugee experience, and particularly what it means to take leave, both in sort of epistemological sense, a larger mental sense, but physically. And thinking about refugee, not just refugee experience, but refugee knowledge. And I think this is what has kind of led me to think about different information systems, how they influence people, and the different scales in which they're operating. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to questions.
Great, thank you so much. And if you could please identify yourself, that'd be great.
You don't have to hold it just needs to be near you.
Okay, fine. Hi, Professor. Thank you. Really interesting talk. I'm a G1 first-year PhD student in the HEAL program here. Work mainly on sort of modern Xinjiang history, but I'm very interested in more broad things than that. I had a question actually at a much broader scale than some of what you were working on, which is how does, or does the environment feature much in your work on war-being? You know, I know that a lot of work on say the kind of the refugee community or Waishenren in Taiwan, and all the literature and so on thinks about the ways in which people from say the northeast find themselves in the summer in Taipei, and that sense of alienation, displacement becomes quite a major. It's sort of environmentally tinged displacement and alienation becomes a major part of how they've experienced that shift. So I was wondering, both in terms of obviously the physical difficulty in movement during certain times of the year, but also in terms of people finding themselves in new environments, how kind of that environmental side of things affects war-being. So thank you.
Thanks. Should I answer, or should we take a bunch of questions?
If there isn't, why don't you start?
Okay, all right, okay, great. That's an excellent question, thank you. And I've been trying to, I originally was thinking about this in terms of like urban life, urban design, finding your ways in cities and so on, but I've been trying to take it more broadly and seriously recently, partly due to working with my student Richard Scher, who's now a postdoc here in the Mahindra Center, because his research is on fishers and boat-dwelling people around Lake Tai. So everything I've learned about boats comes from him, but he knows more than I do on boats. So thinking about this, I think the kinds of transportation figures into this, the kinds of transportation that certain people, I think maybe this ties into this Waishenren question, like what someone who was living in a city might be accustomed to. So people are pretty accustomed to taking the train between Nanjing and Shanghai at that point. But then in the fall of 1937, it's not just cities that are bombed, it's that trains are often bombed, transport lines are bombed. People, actually rural areas are bombed too, so kind of this idea of vulnerability and where you are safe becomes radically disrupted. And so people, I think I'm very interested in this idea of people who have that kind of knowledge world and experience, but maybe don't have the knowledge world experience of like, how do you get yourself on a fishing boat? How do you talk to the fishermen? How do you find such a boat? So I think that's where these like local connections and relations and word of mouth become so important. I think also like if we look in the city, the short history of the kind of like evacuation of Nanjing or flight from Nanjing, where you're living makes a great deal of difference, whether people are near the river and they can either hide or find a way across the river versus if they're, in the mountainous areas or hilly areas. So that makes it a big difference. But I think the other part of your question was sort of about how people adjust to the areas that they're going to. And this becomes a real problem with resettlement, because with resettlement plans, there is an idea that, yes, we can kind of like universally teach people how to farm. It turns out that many of the refugees who were resettled were not farmers anyway, or they were farmers from a completely different region of China. And similarly for the Dachshund people, there was they were fishers, and they get resettled in many places around Taiwan, and they don't have boats, they can't fish. Just the ones who are in the north and Geelong can do that. So part of the State Department money went to like teaching women how to sew, for like commercial production or other kinds of semi-skilled labor. And a lot of the U.S. State Department did not think that money was well used. They complained vociferously after a couple of years that this is just like not working, which makes sense if you take people completely out of their natural and work environment and cultural environment. It's a difficulty.
If I can just piggyback on what you were just talking about right now with regard to resettlement, and you mentioned sort of the kind of military and sort of strategic aspects of this also. And that sort of makes one think, of course, about longer practices, including Tuntian, which, earlier imperial sort of formations have practiced. Did you see sort of that kind of acknowledgement that we're part of this much longer tradition of statecraft and using sort of, again, Lyon people who are not necessarily trained for military purposes, but they serve military interests in some ways? Or do you see this as some kind of departure from those longer standing practices?
So that's a really good question. I've been searching for the evidence that there was that acknowledgement for a long time, and I haven't found it. But it's there. I mean, obviously the precedent is there. I think that there's a more proximate model, which is what's going on in the Japanese Empire too. Particularly if you look at like the movements of population in Korea and the northern part of the Korean peninsula. But that's also kind of unspoken too. This connection that is spoken tends to be more to the kind of, the almost like Christian charitable idea of like those who help themselves, help those who help themselves, this kind of this tension within like global humanitarianism. Do you just give people aid, or do they have to like somehow demonstrate that they're worthy of aid? But I think it's there. The precedent is very much in the minds of some people. I think.
Rebecca, thank you so much for this talk. At the beginning, you said, war being is this concept that you toying around as a potential title for this, and you've given us, from several angles, the various experiences of being on the road, on the move, in the midst of the war. And I was wondering if I could just hear a little bit, if we could hear a little bit more about your arrival at this term, war being, and what some sort of contending potential titles or contending gerunds to attach after war. Because I mean, just off your current talk, it just felt that it didn't fully capture the mobility that was so evident all throughout the presentation. I was wondering if maybe it sort of is representative of other parts of the project. Or I just want to hear more about war being.
Yeah. So I think the title that I've been working with for a long time is probably not like fully representative either. It's Living and Dying in the Long War. But that kind of gets at what I'm trying to think about here, which is, so I kind of started with this question of like community formation. How do people who are displaced form community? And what immediately became evident is that they can do it, sort of physically, they can do it on native place lines, they can do it on familial lines, but there's also a constant thinking about the relationship between the dead and the living. And so another part of my work has to do with the middle part of the book is about kind of like the post-war period that never was, or that quickly becomes civil war. But a lot of the activity during that period was not just the return of evacuees or refugees to their former communities, but the moving of bodies and the reburying of bodies. And particularly for native place associations or for larger lineage units, they frame this in not just in like terms of responsibility of the dead, but in terms of basically repair. So it does link to this kind of like late imperial idea of like what is shanho. It is that involves that kind of moral and like spiritual renewal as well as just aid. So that's part of what I'm trying to get to, but it may not be a satisfactory title still. So
how about belonging?
Mm.
The theme of belonging itself connects to you're saying about community and settlement and the like. So
Yeah.
War belonging.
War belonging.
War belonging,
Some
yeah.
variant, some that's right.
I will take all suggestions. Thank you. I'm still thinking about it.
Thank you so much, Professor Nedostup, for this fascinating talk. I have two small questions. The first concerns the diary from Sun Jingyun. So I was just struck and would love to learn more about how about the act of writing itself in shaping and producing what you describe as the information system, and not only the refugee experience and also knowledge, and or maybe there could be other, like as you mentioned, like other different medias, maybe like letter writing, although I assume that the postal situation isn't great, and also like narration. So just asking how do these media, different forms of media, come into interplay. So that's the first question. And the second one is a minor question. When you were on your slide of the class and the perception of the flight, there's a fascinating article by, I guess, Wo Putao and Shangren Fu. So I was just also curious about the gender dimension, as you said, in the process of flight, but also in the process of the rather national rhetoric of staying and to like this place bond idea. Yes, so yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've been I think it's really worth digging into a little bit more this kind of act of writing and narration, and that in itself has its own temporality, in the sense that like if the newspapers in late 1937 actually do also have a lot of essays, sort of like immediate recountings of refugee conditions or what it took to travel between Tianjin and Nanjing, for instance. So a lot of these produced by reporters. So there's the like on the ground reporting first. But then there are these diaries as well, and they, of course, like some of them have, especially in the past several decades, generated their own kind of cottage industry of republication and circulation, and focusing on diaries as a particular way of representing wartime experience. But I think within those republications, like a lot of them are, some of them are clearly written in the moment, some of them are retrospective, and then some of them you're not quite sure actually when they were written. So there is, but I think within the diaries very often there is this sense of attempting to insert some kind of either affective content or explanatory content. So this idea, like, in the case of this particular diary, there's lots of comments about, like, this woman that helped them, like she was, like several times she said that as if sent from heaven. And so a kind of a second voice that is sort of observing from a little bit of a outsider stance what is going on. But I think as you get farther into the war, though, there's maybe less of that. They become much more scattered, and maybe less, that people don't have opportunity to think about this. And then the things that are produced after the war or published after the war, it comes back again, that kind of explanatory power. I would say literary writing is actually important too for thinking about the experience of, especially moving over long distances, because a lot of that only emerges through like collected essays or short stories. Especially there are a number of ones about like the experience of being in a ship or a train that is bombed. And so there's that. The gender thing and the perception of flight, I think that article in particular, yeah, it's doing dual duty. You're right in the sense that it is meant as a message to civilians, and particularly just like the kind of like shopkeeper or like middle class sorts. But having it in the voice of a woman adds another element to it. It's like meant to reach more broadly across society, would be my guess. And also it's kind of like playing on the trope of business women are savvy. Like a woman who runs a shop, she knows everything. And so we have to listen to her because she'll know the truth or know the score. So I think that's, if you dig into that piece, that's the voice kind of like is, I'm practical and even I'm not going. So it has that kind of language.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this wonderful presentation. So my name is Richard Shi. I'm a postdoc research fellow at Mahindra Center here at Harvard. So I really appreciate that you try to analyze the first-person narratives about the kind of refugee experiences and put that together into a bigger landscape, bigger picture about the overall social changes. So based on that, I just have two quick questions. The first one is that I wonder, because you offer us a lot of examples about how they chose to run away, right, and in what different ways. So I just wonder, based on your observation, I wonder when and under what kind of circumstances that those people will decide that will stop moving. Right, because you actually gave us a very good example about the guy that decided stop hiding from the bombs. Right? So that's one case. But also, when will they kind of try to resettle themselves, and instead of still moving into other places? Right? And we also know that there are so many different choices that they can take. Either move westward, following the government, or move northward into the kind of Subang areas. So I just wonder whether we can say a little bit more about that. The other part, attention on that, is that I wonder when they are arranging their roads, how much they will also put religious sites or religious facilities into consideration. Because we know that a lot of the studies, for example, like the Nanjing massacre, is based on the kind of the Christian facilities, the charity, right? But you also mentioned that they have something to do with the popular religions. So how much those will also offer them some other options when they are doing their decisions? Thank you.
Thanks. I'll start with the second question first. I think it's everywhere in the sources and it's nowhere in the sense that, of course, temples are being requisitioned for barracks for soldiers, but they're also, a lot of them are serving as places where refugees can stay. And so it's everywhere in that sense, but it's hard to find a source where those sites are talked about as religious sites or as, anything other than just like immediate refuge. And they're over the longer term, maybe, yeah. But it's in this very short term period, like the few months that I was talking about in 1937, it's not quite clear. I would say I could say a lot more about religious networks, but I'll keep it at that. The question about like when to stop, I think it has to do with maybe what kind of ties people have, where their families are, what their families are like, what their families' resources are. So you get like there's like a very distinct difference between the two, the oral history and the diary that I talked about, in the sense that for the diary, they know like where the hometown of the one member of the family is. They know that there are relatives there, and that's where they decide to stop. But then for Chen Guishang, she has no relatives, but she has the grandmother, and then there's no one, and she's 13 years old and are counting. So for her, deciding to stop is just like, no one's telling me to go, or no one's assaulting me, essentially. It's a kind of different framework.
Great. So I think we have maybe time for one final round. I see a couple of hands. Maybe we'll take both questions together.
Sure.
So on this side.
I can come closer.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So Curran, College of the Holy Cross, and associate here. Hi, Rebecca.
Hey.
I just had a question about periodization. So you talked about using the Long War as maybe one of your titles. I saw that you had a real kind of resistance to post-war. You had it in quotes. And so are you thinking about using the refugee knowledge to really challenge, in a more strong way with this book, our sense of periodization? Hans van der Ven goes from 31, I think, to 53, but really it's dominated by the Korean War. You're already doing something a little bit different. Do you have any thoughts on sort of staking a larger claim for some sort of other periodization? Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm a PhD candidate in Boston University, and I study. Thank you. And I studied Christian rural reconstruction in Sichuan during the Sino-Japanese War. So, and when you talk about the farm projects in Sichuan and as a resettlement strategy, I noticed that on your slides you highlight biopolitics and border as key elements. So could you elaborate it a little more? Thank you.
Yes, so periodization, yes. I am trying to rethink that in the sense of, I have resistance about the term post-war just because it seems that post-war, like decolonization, is one of those terms that emerges out of global history and then is very fraught when we talk about China and Taiwan, like where is the post-war process, where is the decolonization process? And it is there, but it is also at the same time being accompanied by continued conflict. So I'm kind of influenced by Hoon Kwan and his like the other Cold War in that thinking. So my view is from the using the history of displacement as the basis, since so many of the people involved have been multiply displaced, or they are being influenced by political and social scenarios which carry the memory of that earlier displacement or the experience of that earlier displacement with them. That from that point of view, it does make more sense to talk about these three periods, the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Civil War and the Cold War, as a kind of continuous conflict. I end at the end of the 50s because at that point I'm mostly talking about Taiwan, and there's like with the reconfiguration of the military, how the military can settle in Taiwan, that they can get married and have families, and the kind of quiet abandonment of the idea of retaking the mainland kind of shapes that. It's possible to go back well before 1937, though, I think, because a lot of these people are being displaced by various conflicts of the 1920s and the early 1930s. So it's a practical choice to start in 1937. This idea of biopolitics, I think, is because in the case of these resettlement schemes, it is really moving from an idea of like aid as a humanitarian act to the literal mobilization of bodies, but then the productive labor of bodies to engage in the war effort. And so I see those as kind of like the two sides of the aid coin in a way. And so these are very kind of literal schemes to capture the labor and the bodies of people who are resettled. And it's also meant to capture mentalities as well. There's a lot of patriotic education that is going on in these farms as well. And it really is unsuccessful from the reports I've read, but that is part of the effort as well.
Great. Okay, well, we're at time, so please join me in thanking Professor Rebecca Nedostup.
Thanks so much.
And we look forward to the book.
Me too. Thanks so much.